Murray, staff scientist with the National Wildlife Federation's Great Lakes office in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Well, I'm actually based in Georgia now, but still focus of my work is on Great Lakes issues, and which has included work around toxic chemicals for over a couple of decades. Faye mentioned the Toxics Free Great Lakes Network, which is co-chaired by NWF and CELA, Canadian Environmental Law Association, with the purpose to advance a binational approach, that is US and Canada, towards the virtual elimination of toxic chemicals in the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River Basin. And that's really through, in particular, an effective implementation of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Some of our recent work has included an emphasis on providing input to the co-chairs of the Annex 3 process under the agreement, focused on chemicals of mutual concern, and input on the draft binational strategies that have been developed by the Annex 3 teams, and recently that's included on PCBs and polybrominated diphenyl ethers and mercury, and there are more binational strategies that will be coming up in the next few months or so that we'll also be providing input on. We've also been providing input on criteria that the parties are using in designating chemicals as chemicals of mutual concern for subsequent action. I also wanted to acknowledge John Jackson, who's the co-chair of the Toxics Free Great Lakes Network, has been a long-time, or was a long-time member of Great Lakes United. Has worked on binational approaches to chemicals and other issues in the Great Lakes for a number of years, and is on the call, as well as Faye, who you've already heard from, who we've been working with extensively on this project. She's been co-coordinating this sub-network of the Great Lakes Network. So in terms of the webinar objectives, basically we're envisioning an overview to basically start a conversation with NGOs and others in the region and beyond on binational work towards implementing the virtual elimination principle within the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement for toxic chemicals. Today we're focusing on endocrine disrupting chemicals in particular. And then this is the first in a two-part series. We'll have a second webinar on June 26th in a couple weeks with Bev Thorpe of Clean Production Action, and that will be focused on chemicals and products and approaches to reducing or eliminating their use in products, which has obviously implications for the Great Lakes. So in terms of today's objectives, we want to have an overview of endocrine disrupting chemicals in the Great Lakes, including having a history of the research and efforts to address these chemicals, and then a little bit of an overview on more recent concerns and approaches to endocrine disrupting chemicals. So a lot of this is going to be basically talking about the problem that we're seeing with these chemicals and their presence in the basin and effects through the years. And then in particular with the second webinar later this month, we'll be looking a little bit more at basically approaches trying to solve the problem, deal with the problem. So in terms of our two presenters today, our first up will be Michael Gilbertson, who started working on effects of chemicals on colonial water birds in the Great Lakes Basin in 1969, worked on the regulation of PCBs and other persistent toxic substances in the late 1970s. And before he retired from the Great Lakes Regional Office of the International Joint Commission, he organized workshops on how to infer that the conditions and diseases observed in fish, wildlife, and humans in the Great Lakes Basin were caused by exposures to persistent toxic chemicals. Our second presenter will be Meg Sears, who's an Ottawa-based environmental health researcher with broad education and experience, including chemistry, engineering, medicine, and scientific methods. As chair of the Prevent Cancer Now group, she addresses exposures that contribute to malignancy and chronic disease and methods of toxicant assessment. She's been an adjunct investigator at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario Research Institute, where she led a project on approaches to addressing toxic elements in Canadians. And she's also written about medical perspectives on environmental sensitivities for the Canadian Human Rights Commission, worked on large medical reviews at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, and is currently spearheading an environmental health information infrastructure initiative at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. So in terms of presentations, we'll go straight from Michael's to Meg's, and excuse me, and then have a discussion period afterwards with Q&A. If questions occur to you during the presentations, you can type those in the chat box, and then we'll aim to address those during that Q&A session, but we'll also have the phone lines open as well to take questions over the phone. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Michael Gilbertson.
Hello, thank you very much for that introduction. Perhaps we could go straight to the first slide, please. Can you go to the first slide? This really gives the context of much of what we're going to talk about this morning. In Canada, we have an extraordinary level of increase of health costs. And this was some data that came out very recently from the Canadian Institutes for Health Information, and shows the sort of trajectory that we are on in terms of what we are going to have to spend in the future on healthcare. Next one, please. Next, right. Very recently, there was a report that came out in The Lancet, and it stated that pollution is the largest environmental cause of disease and premature death in the world today. And it addressed known pollutants such as air pollution, persistent organic pollutants, metals, radionuclides. But really what came out of this was just how serious the chemicals that interfere with the hormones and developmental processes are, that are acting at very low doses, and the chemicals such as pesticides, pharmaceuticals, nanomaterials, and so on. The important part was that the Lancet Commission was acknowledging how serious pollution is in terms of disease in the world, and amongst those various factors, they pinpointed endocrine disruptors. Next one, please. We need a definition, really, and the definition I like is the one taken from the International Endocrine Society. A hormone disruptive substance is an exogenous chemical or mixture of chemicals that interferes with any aspect of hormone action. And one of the assumptions that came out of this was that environmental chemicals that interfere with any aspect of hormone action should be presumed to produce adverse effects. Next one, please. What we need to do is to recognize and regulate environmental endocrine disrupting chemicals. There is, however, a contested priority in the global regulatory context. For example, in the European Parliament, the REACH legislation has missed several implementation deadlines. And I think it's important to understand for us in the Great Lakes Basin that much of the endocrine disruptor story actually came out of research here in the Great Lakes. So the central question of this webinar is, how are endocrine disrupting chemicals being addressed in the Great Lakes Basin? Next one. In 2012, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was renegotiated and signed after 8 years of public consultation. There were incorporated into it some new principles and objectives. It incorporated a principle of using the ecosystem approach, using adaptive management, and an objective involving habitat. There was, however, no specific reference in the agreement to either endocrine or hormone. And I think this was regressive, and these two very specific agents should really have been brought out in the agreement. Next one, please. So I looked at the 2017 State of the Great Lakes report and also the recent triennial IJC report to see what they were saying about endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I went through the reports, and I can honestly say that there was no credible Great Lakes data collection and research programs in relation to humans, mammals, reptiles, or fish. There was nothing in there. There were chemical levels, but there was nothing on effects or what the significance of these chemicals actually were in terms of populations of these organisms. There was no epidemiology, there was no epizootiology. There was a minimal program reported for herring gull eggs that had been picked up, analyzed, and archived. And there were a few reproductive parameters and physiological markers which were referred to in relation to birds. But there was a major focus both on habitat and on the fisheries status. But the surprising part was that no part of the fisheries story was related to endocrine disrupting chemicals. It was as though chemicals had been a nuisance in getting into fish, but they had not actually had any effect on the fish themselves or their populations. Next one, please. Well, Meg can take over from here for the next piece, okay?
Just give us one moment. We're going to switch to Meg. Okay, Meg, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Michael. That's a tremendous start. Yes, Theo Colborn was very interested in pharmacology and the molecular biology, and she had noted these reproductive effects in Great Lake fish-eating birds and in ranch mink that had been fed Great Lakes fish, and the decline and crash, indeed, of the Great Lakes lake trout. And she'd noted these developmental effects, the deformities, the feminization of amphibians and fish, and also human studies, a human study looking at deficits in children of fish eaters. Next one, please. Next slide, please. And this came together in 1991 at the Wing Spread Conference. 21 scientists came up with a consensus statement, and these findings were pulled together in a rather well-known book published in 1996, Our Stolen Future, that was subtitled, Are We Threatening Our Fertility, Intelligence, and Survival? A Scientific Detective Story. Next slide, please. So this background in pharmacology and toxicology, to give you a bit of details, one example was diethylstilbestrol, or DES, that was a drug taken during a period of time for by pregnant women who were at risk of premature delivery. And they realized that the daughters were much more likely to develop a cancer called clear cell vaginal carcinoma. We've since found that the male, the sons, they had increases in testicular cancer. There were higher levels of birth defects, lower fertility. And more recently, they've published that there are multi-generational neurological deficits in these DES children and their offspring. Another example that's well known was of DDT that exhibited estrogenic activity in experimental birds and mammals. Next slide, please. So the endocrine system, to step back and give you a bit of background, you can see that it's very potent. It's a signaling system. It is part of the orchestration of biology. We know that signaling in the body is done by the nervous system. That's electrical. We have thoughts and conscious movements. There's the regular actions of your heart and so on, and spontaneous reactions to, for instance, pain. But a more primitive, the most fundamental, the very first signaling system before your body even develops a nervous system is the endocrine system. This is signaling via hormones. that starts right at conception. It modulates the development and the senescence, the sexuality and reproduction. This happens naturally with what we call hormones, but there are commercial chemicals, residues, and things like pesticides, contaminants in our, not just contaminants, but actual products that we use for personal care and in plastics, etc., that can look like hormones, they can act like hormones, they can interfere with these kinds of actions. And when that happens, there are very fundamental changes within the body. Next slide, please. These endocrine disrupting chemicals actually manage to bind with a receptor. That's how these messages are passed along. A chemical binds with a receptor, which then precipitates another action. So they may bind in a way that mimics the effect of a hormone, so you get inappropriate function. It might actually block the receptor site and stop the signaling, so you have inappropriate inhibition. Or there can be other effects that lead to increases or decreases in hormone production. Next slide, please. So not only do we have very complex interactions between chemicals and these sites, they have a number of very fundamental functions. And depending upon the time of exposure, you can have very fundamental changes in the development, and these have lifelong implications. So this is just a diagram of how a blastocyte, the zygote, and the embryo and the fetus develops. And so if you've got interference with hormones at a particular time, you will have changes perhaps before the mother even recognizes that she's pregnant in the central nervous system. You can have effects on the eyes and the heart, etc., as the fetus develops. Next slide, please. And you can have very complex dose responses. The way we currently regulate chemicals, we assume that a little bit isn't too bad and a lot is worse. But in fact, with endocrine disrupting chemicals, you can't make that sort of assumption in terms of the effects downstream. So these are just a couple of examples of the non-linear responses and non-monotonic. It doesn't continuously increase in the same way of benzene and leukemia, and then the second one has to do with hexachlorobenzene and the responses in a monocellular system. So you have increased responses at low concentrations and very low concentrations, and then as the receptor sites become saturated, you can have decreased responses. Next slide. And what does this look in reality? On the right-hand side, we see a mouse that was fed 100 parts per billion of DES. On the left-hand side, we see, this is what a mouse would look like if it was fed 1 parts per billion of DES, or none at all. Sorry, 100 parts per billion DES, or none at all on the left. Hello?
Ready to order? Just 1 second.
There's somebody coming through on the...
I think someone joined the call. Just give us 1 second.
Okay, no problem. Could I have the next slide, please?
Yeah, just give me 1 second here. Go ahead.
So in Canadians, we're seeing that the Public Health Agency of Canada reports that chronic diseases are increasing. These chronic diseases, this is a compilation of cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and hypertension. All of these can be related to endocrine disruptors. They're increasing in younger Canadians. They're increasing over time. So very soon, actually, we've already surpassed the levels in the oldest population that they bulked together, with higher levels of disease in the 45 to 64-year-old. So this is not, chronic disease is no longer simply a disease of aging. This is an environmental disease. Next slide, please. We also know that sperm quality and quantity is less than half what it used to be in the early 1980s. Next slide, please. Autism spectrum disorder has gone up to 1 in 5,000 in the early 1970s. Public Health Agency of Canada reported this year that it's gone up to 1 in 66 Canadian children. This is the data from Quebec. At the time of publication, Ontario data was not yet available. Next slide, please. Canadian Cancer Society reported that although overall cancers are on an age-adjusted basis are staying the same, when you dig into the data, tobacco-associated cancers are going down. That's good news. Tobacco control works. But these endocrine-related cancers are increasing. Next slide, please. And we've seen this is one example of looking at flame retardants, which we know interfere with thyroid function. At the end of the Great Lakes, we have the St. Lawrence River. At the end of the St. Lawrence River, we have Newfoundland. On the west and southern shores of Newfoundland, we have more polluted fish. People are eating these fish, and the people have higher levels of flame retardants and higher levels of hypothyroidism compared to the cleaner fish and water and people along that are on the eastern shores. Next slide, please. And these health costs of these endocrine disrupting chemicals are related to this list of conditions of cancers, obesity and diabetes, autoimmune conditions, reproductive and birth defects. Next slide, please. It's been reported that for the US, this is associated with a cost approximately 2.3% of GDP, and in the European Union, about 1.3% of the GDP. We don't have Canadian data. But health costs of endocrine disrupting chemicals are substantial. And that's not even before you talk about the human costs. Next slide, please. So how did we get so lost? And Michael is going to explain that for us.
Thank you, Meg. I think this is the central question that we really need to ask. How is it that after all this length of time, the International Joint Commission in its triennial report, and also the two parties, the US government and the Canadian government, in their reports, did not address the whole issue of endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I think we need to understand the historical context of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and try to understand what the agreement is about, what it is not about, and how we got lost. The agreement really comes from Article 4 of the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty. And that article says that the two parties agreed not to pollute the boundary waters to the injury of property or health on the other side. And I've added that emphasis. Injury of property or health. Next one, please. In 1964, the International Joint Commission was sent a reference by the two governments, and they were asked to study pollution of Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and the international section of the St. Lawrence River. And the question that they were asked, pursuant to Article 4, is, have the boundary waters of the lower Great Lakes being polluted to the injury of health and property. And in 1969, which was when I started working for the Canadian government, we received the positive responses from the two boards that had been set up, one for Lake Ontario and one for Lake Erie. Next one, please. It's necessary to understand the 1960s as an extraordinary period of social change. There was a coalescence of social movements. In the 1970s, in response to this, there was very extensive social and administrative reform. And part of that reform was that in 1972, the two parties signed and negotiated and signed the Great Lakes, the first Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And the initial focus at that time was on eutrophication. And this led to the successful control of phosphorus loadings into the Great Lakes. And that 1972 agreement also gave special roles to the International Joint Commission. One was to set up a Great Lakes Regional Office, also to set up the Great Lakes Water Quality Board to address the regulatory and control programs, and it also set up a Research Advisory Board. Next one, please. Now, at around that time, I was working on fish-eating birds, and there were declines in populations of bald eagles, ospreys, gulls, terns, and cormorants. There were also very serious reproductive failures characterized by egg mortality, but also eggshell thinning. But the other piece which was new was that there were deformities which were occurring. I initially found them in terns, but then I also found them in gulls and cormorants. At the same time, there was extensive research being undertaken on why mink, which were fed fish from the Great Lakes, had such serious reproductive failures. Now, what I recognized at that time was that we had teratogenic substances in the Great Lakes. And the immediate question that arose was, well, what are the implications for human health, reproduction, and development? Next one, please. And this is some work that was done by Joe and Sandra Jacobson, really to try to respond to that question. And this was just one part of their research on a cohort of infants that they put together, whose mothers had eaten fish from Lake Michigan. And what they were able to show was that in terms of a memory test for these children, the more that the PCBs they were exposed to, particularly in utero, the poorer the memory scale. Next one, please. Well, one of the problems in the 1970s was we had no idea as to whether the situation was getting better or worse. And I recognized that there was a need for a long-term monitoring program. And after looking at the data for very many different species that I'd worked on, I chose the herring gull as the most appropriate species for a long-term monitoring program. But the other aspect is not just to analyze eggs that have been picked up, but also to archive samples so that on a retrospective basis, you can reconstruct the exposures which have been occurring when you suddenly clue to the fact that there is a chemical that you had not suspected, which has been out there. Next one, please. The Great Lakes science was extraordinarily influential in developing legislation. In Canada, it resulted and was very much the influential process. It resulted in the Environmental Contaminants Act being passed in 1975. And we put in regulations on polychlorinated biphenyls and on polybrominated biphenyls. Now, that may be a surprise. By 1979, we had completely banned PBBs from commerce in Canada. Well, you can see what subsequently happened, because about 20 years later, the chemists were able to go back to the archived herringull samples, and they could retrospectively show that polybrominated diphenyl ethers had been inappropriately substituted as flame retardants. Next one, please. The evidence which we brought forward through the 1970s was very influential in the subsequent renegotiation of the agreement. And in 1978, there was a radical new policy which was put forward, which was called the virtual elimination of discharges of persistent toxic substances. Now, there have been enormous difficulties in interpreting this. Do you go about the process of developing standards and criteria and finding out as to whether people are in compliance with it? Do you look for the chemical analytical detection limit and say, well, that's virtual elimination? Or do you in fact have to go to the field and say, well, there has to be an absence of observed effects in wild populations of affected organisms? And at the same time, the IJC introduced, through one of its publications, the ecosystem approach. Now, the problem with the ecosystem approach, which may sound benign, is that it really was ambiguous, and it has contested meanings and paradigms between the different scientists from different disciplines. For the IJC, the original idea in terms of water quality was to look at the multimedia routes of contamination by a variety of different kinds of chemicals. It did, however, mean a completely different thing to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. It was really focused on habitat and the introduction of alien species, and they believed that their fisheries declines had been caused by many different agents all acting at the same time. So here were two completely different ideas around the ecosystem approach, and this is part of the reason why we have got really badly lost in terms of the focus for the IJC work and for the government's work and for reporting on a biennial or triennial basis. Next one, please. The second reason why I believe we got seriously lost was that in 1980, President Reagan embraced neoliberal ideology. And here he is shaking hands with Friedrich von Hayek. He, as you may famously remember, said, government is the problem. And he wanted small government, and it resulted in reduced budgets for environmental health research and monitoring. It resulted in deregulation. And within the bureaucracies, it resulted in a social construction of Great Lakes science, which had to be focused on good news stories only. Next one. By 1989, there was an extraordinary coalescence of interests on the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Greenpeace, Pollution Probe, Great Lakes United, Canadian Environmental Law Association, the National Wildlife Federation, they all coalesced and they organized caravans around the Great Lakes. And they brought 1,500 people to the IJC biennial meeting in Hamilton. Another aspect that changed at that time was that the Science Advisory Board really brought out a report that focused on health, particularly human health, and the effects that had been occurring as a result of chemicals. Theo Colborn brought out her book called Great Lakes, Great Legacy, which told the history of this story of research into contaminants in the Great Lakes. She also, of course, brought forward her endocrine disruptor hypothesis. The Council of Great Lakes research managers had held the first of their cause-effect linkages workshops, and they thereby changed the statements which were being made by scientists who are now prepared to talk about the injury that had actually occurred in fish, wildlife, and human populations, and the specific chemical causes of that injury. Next one, please. Now, this is a slide which John Jackson provided to me, and it's historic because if you look on the right-hand side of the podium, there is David Fulton, who was the new co-chair of the IJC, and on the left of the podium, you can see Gordon Darnell. And particularly Gordon Darnell went on to make the decision that the 5th biennial report of the IJC to governments would focus on the 1978 policy, and he would recommend to the governments that they should implement their policy on virtual elimination of discharges of persistent toxic substances. In fact, the IJC became advocates and activists for about 3 years. Next one, please. Well, by 1992, the politics had changed. Gordon Darnell wrote a book called The Making of a Conservative Environmentalist. And in that book, he reports that the chemical industry has got into the President Clinton's White House to try to make sure that there is an appointment of commissioners who were, quote, not as green as the current bunch. And there was a pushback in terms of a focus on chemicals. Next one, please. And this very much, I'm afraid, is the result. There has been really a serious regulatory failure in the two countries. And this is reflected in the State of the Great Lakes report. After 40 years of chemical regulation under TSCA and under SEPA, what we see on the left-hand side is increasing brominated diphenyl ether levels between 2008 and 2012. And on the right-hand side, you can see widespread contamination with the perfluorinated compounds. Next one, please. So what can we summarize and conclude from this? So in terms of the science, the chronic endocrine-related disease in younger Canadians are rising rapidly, healthcare costs are rising rapidly, and there's likely link to pollution caused by endocrine disruption. Great Lakes wildlife observations indicated that we had teratogens in the Great Lakes. There were neurological deficits in infants of Great Lakes fish eaters. The mechanistic models implicated chemicals that disrupt cellular signaling, and endocrine disruptor science largely arose from Great Lakes research, and the scientific principles and importance of endocrine disrupting chemicals are now well established, but are not being used in terms of regulatory controls. Next one, please. Really, the endocrine disruptor chemicals fell off the agenda. There was shifting focus of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement using this ambiguous ecosystem approach. And it shifted from pollution to habitat and land use, which was really a Great Lakes Fishery Commission priority. And this is what I've called a diversionary reframing of the agreement. There's been a neoliberal hiatus on the priority on chemical contaminants under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement programs. Research, monitoring, and regulatory programs on endocrine disrupting chemicals have been terminated. There has been a regulatory failure. We've had repeated introduction of substances of very high concern into international commerce. And national governments seem to have been reluctant to proscribe manufacture, sale, importation, and use of endocrine disrupting chemicals, or to require the pragmatic, least toxic best practices. There is widespread contamination, and we must deduce that there have been costly effects as a result of this. But there's still a lack of routine monitoring and reporting, which has been hindered progress. Thank you very much.
Thanks much, Michael.